12, 13, and 14. He starts out in chapter 12, verse 1, and he says, "Now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I would not have you to be ignorant." And he begins to deal with that issue. Corinthians, you have to remember how Corinthians, its position in Paul's epistles. Romans is doctrine about grace and about the cross. And Corinthians and Galatians, the next two books, are reproof and correction. Corinthians is reproof, Galatians is correction. Reproof is about behavior, correction is about doctrine. And they fit in that design of 2 Timothy 3:16. The Corinthians were carnal. Are you not carnal? Walk as men, he tells them in chapter 3. And the Corinthians were focused on their flesh. They'd understood the doctrines of grace, but they were still walking after their flesh. To be carnal means to be influenced by your flesh. The Galatians were, they were doctrinally mistaken. They were legalist. And in our modern terminology, the Corinthians would be the Charismatics and the Galatians would be the Calvinists. And when you see people today, you'll see that if they don't get established in the book of Romans in grace doctrine about the cross work and about what God's doing today, both doctrinally and dispensationally in the ministry of grace or the ministry of the Apostle Paul, if you don't get that, you wind up either being a Charismatic or a Calvinist, a Corinthian or a Galatian. And it's fascinating how you can go around and watch what goes on out there and say, that's Galatianism, that's Corinthianism, and you see it all over. Well, the Corinthians were focused, that these spiritual gifts were working in their midst, but they were doing it, they had that carnal viewpoint about it. Chapter 14, he says, follow after charity, and that's what chapter 13 was all about. And desire spiritual gifts, but rather that you prophesy. Now, when it says desire spiritual gifts, that takes you back to chapter 12, the way he ended chapter number 12. He says in chapter 12, after having given you the issue of here are the gifts, here's how the Spirit of God works. The Spirit gives them to every person individually as He wills. Chapter 12, verse 7, the manifestation of the Spirit is given to every man to profit withal. The Holy Spirit gives different individuals different gifts, spiritual gifts, for the profit not of the individual, but for the profit of everybody. He gave different gifts to different people, but He didn't give it for you. He gave it for the good of the group. In other words, you weren't given a gift just for your enhancement. You were given the gift for the benefit of the whole group. He says in verse 11, all these worketh that one and self-same Spirit, dividing to every man severally as He, the Spirit, will. So the Holy Spirit would give different gifts, but He did it to profit withal, to profit everybody, not just for the individual's aggrandizement. Then in verse number 28, God hath set some in the church, first apostles, second early prophets, thirdly teachers. After that, gifts of miracles, gifts of healing, helps, government, diversities of tongues. He gave all these gifts, but notice there's a categorization of them. There's, first of all, apostles, second early prophets, thirdly teachers. After that, there are these intervention gifts, miracles, healings, helps, governments, diversities of tongues. We've talked about those things. So there are categories. Some gifts are more valuable than others, and that's why it says in verse 31, covet earnestly the best gifts. So if you go back to verse 28 and you read down, what would be the best ones? Apostles, prophets, teachers. What would be the least of the gifts? What's the last two, or the last one? Tongues. So which would be the better gift, prophecy or tongues? So if he says the assembly, when he says in verse 31, covet earnestly the best gifts, yet show unto you a more excellent way, the you there is the assembly. It's not talking about individual. He didn't say thou art to do it. He said you, the assembly. In the assembly, they were to desire the better gifts to be in operation. Well, he just told you what the best ones were. Prophecy. The least valuable was the tongues in the list that and I didn't give that list, he gave it, okay? And then he says, but let me show you a more excellent way. The Corinthians thought, obviously, that the spiritual gifts was the most excellent ministry of the Holy Spirit. But he says, no, there's a more excellent ministry that the Spirit of God has to operate than the spiritual gifts, and that's the way of charity. Because first 7 verses, he talks about if you have these spiritual gifts, you don't have charity, you're a zip. Charity is more valuable than the spiritual gifts. The reason being, chapter 13, verse 8 and following, the spiritual gifts are going to cease. They're going to pass away. They're going to not operate. They're only temporarily given. How long are they given? Until the completion of the revelation is given through Paul. When you have the complete knowledge, then you don't need the gifts which have to do with the partial revelation, partial knowledge stage. So they're going to pass away. But the Holy Spirit has a more excellent ministry even when they're operating, and that's the way of charity. So when you get to chapter 14, it's not surprising. He says, follow after charity. That's the most excellent ministry of the Holy Spirit. But while all these other things are in operation, desire spiritual gifts, that is, which ones? The most excellent ones. The spiritual gifts you're to desire, chapter 12, verse 31, are the best gifts. Which is the best? Prophecy or tongues? Prophecy, obviously. But rather that you prophesy. So you're to be looking, they're to be seeking the best gifts, understanding that there's a more excellent ministry that's going to come when all the revelation is completely given. Now he's going to start contrasting, and by the way, prophecy is more excellent because, and we looked at this some time ago, prophecy is the gift that made all the other gifts function. You remember he told Timothy, stir up the gift that is given thee by the laying on of my hands and by prophecy. It was the gift of prophecy that identified other people having the other various and sundry gifts. So when he says in verse 2, for he is going to explain why prophecy is more valuable than tongues. For he that speaketh in an unknown tongue speaketh not unto men, but unto God. For no man understandeth him, howbeit in the Spirit he speaketh mysteries. Now, that verse is not a compliment. That verse is explaining, look, tongues don't help anybody because nobody can understand them. They don't even help the person doing it because they can't understand it. And if you can't understand it, there's no edification. But he that prophesieth speaketh unto men to edification, exhortation, and comfort. And that's what you want. You want some ministry that happens so that people get benefit out of what's going on. And so the tongue talking, and what happens, by the way, in the charismatic craziness is they take a verse like verse number 2 and say, I have this special gift from God. I've got my tongue, and I speak in the Spirit. I speak mysteries. So what did you speak? I don't know. Only God knows. Well, it doesn't do you any good. And what they do is they get caught up in the fleshy part, the carnal part of it, the fleshy part. They get caught up in the emotion. They have absolutely no edification comes from it, except that they edify themselves, they puff themselves up. Verse 4, he that speaketh in an unknown tongue edifies who? That's not good. Who should he edify? He that prophesieth edifieth the church. The purpose of the gifts is not to edify you. They were given, chapter 12, verse 7 said very clearly, to profit withal. The gift is given you to profit others, not yourself. And they're selfish, they're self-focused, and what they're doing is they're using the gifts to edify themselves rather than to edify the church. So when he says, he that speaketh in an unknown tongue edifieth himself, that's not a good thing. To use these things for the individual benefit. When they're using tongues to build themselves up in some selfish kind of a sense, they're just on ego trips. They're just showing off. And it caught on because when you go down to verse 23, if therefore the whole church come together in one place and all speaking with tongues, well, were they all supposed to be speaking in tongues? No. He says back in chapter 12, verse 29, he says, are all apostles? No. Are all prophets? No. Are all teachers? No. Are all workers of miracles? No. Do all have the gifts of healing? No. Do all speak with tongues? The answer to every other one was no. So God didn't give everybody the gift of tongues. Well, if y'all come together and everybody's talking in tongues, how do you know who's faking it and who's really doing it? Well, when we get down to the end of chapter 14, he's going to give you 6 tests to tell who's talking in tongues that God's doing and who's faking it till you make it. So he's going to give you some tests to know that. We'll see that when probably next week or so we'll get to that passage. But before we get there, the point in verse 3 and 4 is that tongues, people are just using it and they're edifying it. They're just making a carnal show out of it. But when you prophesy, people hear what you say, they understand what you're saying, and they are edified by it because it's producing some doctrinal understanding in their minds so that they're able to get the information. And go back to chapter 14, verse 5. I would that y'all spake with tongues, but rather that you prophesy. Prophesying is what's better. He said, I wish everybody had these things. I don't want any of you to exalt yourself above another illegitimately, but rather the better thing is that you prophesy. For greater is he that prophesieth than he that speaketh with tongues, except he interpret, that the church may receive edifying. Every time someone spoke in tongues, when God did it, if you go down to verse number 27, if any man speak in an unknown tongue, let it be by 2 or at the most by 3, and that by course, and let one interpret. But if there be no interpreter, let him keep silence in the church. Now, if God is giving the tongue, what will accompany it? An interpreter. Why? Because if God gave the tongue, God will give the interpreter, and the guy can interpret what's being said. Now, an unknown tongue, by the way, is not gibberish. An unknown tongue is a tongue is a language, and an unknown language is a language it's not a language nobody else knows. It's a language you didn't know, that you didn't study. And you're able to speak it, and there's somebody there who can interpret it. And if there's nobody there that knows that, this morning we had a whole bench of Lithuanians sitting right here. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because I can't understand a word they're talking among themselves. I can't understand a word they say when they're speaking in Lithuanian. I understand their English most of the time. But, you think, well, that's an unknown tongue to me. So if I stood up and started speaking Lithuanian, they would be able to interpret it. But what if there was nobody here that could speak that language? Well, then God would give the supernatural capacity, gift of interpreting. But the point is, when it happens, God does it, people can, because it's for the purpose of edifying the saints. By the way, that's one of the tests. You notice in verse 27, if any man speaking an unknown tongue. You see verse 34, let your women keep what? And when he says let your women keep silence, he's not talking about you ladies can't talk. He's talking about tongue talking. If you took the women out of the charismatic craziness, it'd all die. And you all know that. They all know it. Okay? It would die on the vine. Because the thing that propels that stuff is the women in it. My wife and I went to a thing out at the Sears Center 2 years ago, I guess it was, and heard this. I thought the Gaithers were going to be out there in this when this guy on the radio was out there. I misread the poster at the radio station. And what was the preacher's name? I forget. David Jeremiah, that's who it was. And he's a big Baptist preacher. He's on the radio station. And they had this big shindig, the radio station, WYL was helping promote it. So we went out there. Well, the Gaithers didn't show up. I misread it. They were going to be with him in Texas. So I had to hang my head in shame. But anyway, we sat there through this thing. And all of a sudden, everybody's up and they're doing this stuff, and they're singing and and I got to notice, and she said to me, she said, look, it's 80% of people doing that are the women. And the guys are standing there, like this. Because that's not a guy thing. It's the woman thing. And what propels that stuff? You say, well, I see on the TV guy. Look, they had to go find the dude to put him on the camera. You go to those meetings and you see how it happens. And you look at that and you say, what? It just, having begun in the Spirit, are you now made perfect through the flesh? I mean, no. And God doesn't need your flesh to make you, He doesn't need your flesh for these things to operate. So the test, when you get down there, you're going to find it's just men. You got to have an interpreter. And if you don't, keep your mouth shut. Because if the Spirit of God's doing it, He would keep your mouth shut. Because if the Spirit of God's doing it, He would have an interpreter with it. Anyway, back verse 5. I would that you all spake in tongues. The point in these verses here is that tongues don't edify the church. Prophesying edifies the church. Unless there's an interpreter, plain talk is that everybody understands is what edifies the church. And the first issue is godly edification. Not a shindig, not the emotions, but that people would be built up in the faith. I would that you all spake with tongues, but rather that you prophesied. For greater is he that prophesieth than he that speaketh in an unknown tongue, except he interpret that the church may receive edifying. So that's going to be the standard. Now, brethren, I would, if I come unto you speaking with tongues, what shall I profit you, except I shall speak to you either by revelation or by knowledge or by prophesying or by doctrine. See, that's what they're giving revelation. They're giving knowledge. They're giving doctrine. They're producing all those things, and if you can't understand what's being done, it doesn't do any good to just hear it in gibberish. Verse 26, how is it then, brother, when you come together, every one of you hath a psalm, and hath a doctrine, hath a tongue, hath a revelation, hath an interpretation, that all things be done unto what? Edifying. The whole purpose of the gifts is to profit everybody, not in their emotions and their flesh, but in the godly edifying. They don't have a completed Bible to do that. We do now. You don't need all this stuff now to get godly edification. You need the Word of God that you've got in your hands. You need to know how to rightly divide it and get the godly edification is to be edified according to the program God has in operation today. Verse 7, and even things without life giving sound, whether pipe or harp, except they give a distinction in the sound, how shall it be known what is piped or harped? I mean, that's just an argument from common sense. Anything that has a distinct sound, if you can't understand what it is, you hear the piano play. If you don't know what it's, that just makes common sense. The trumpet, the sound. If a trumpet give an uncertain sound, verse 8, who shall prepare himself for the battle? You wonder what it is? You don't know what was that revelry or was that taps? I mean, that makes a difference. So you have to have something that's clear, not just a bunch of tooting of the horn or beating on the piano or knocking a drum in the head of a drum. You need a distinct, clearly understood message. Verse 8, for if the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself to the battle? So likewise, ye, except ye utter by the tongue words easy to be understood, how shall it be known what is spoken? For he shall speak into the air. He speaks mysteries. This just goes into the air, profits nobody. There are, it may be, so many kinds of voices in the world. He's using the illustration. There are, it may be, so many voices in the world, and none of them is without signification. Therefore, if I know not the meaning of the voice, I don't know what I hear the message, but I don't know what it means. I shall be unto him that speaketh a barbarian, and he that speaketh shall be a barbarian unto me. Wow. You see, that's why he says back in verse 2, no man understandeth him, howbeit in the Spirit he speaks mysteries. It's just unintelligible racket. When I was a young kid, my brother, bless his heart, he's a couple of years, 3 years younger than I am, and he wanted to play the drums. So my mom and dad bought he wanted to march in a band playing a drum, a marching band. So my mother and dad bought him a snare drum. He'd hang that thing around his neck, and he would go outside of my bedroom window, underneath the window, and just beat the tar. It's driving me nuts. I'm sitting there trying to study. We're in school. I got the window up because it's Alabama and it's warm, and Travis would be there, just beat that. But he didn't know how to keep time. He was just bang, 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 bang. You can actually make tunes with a drum. You can actually make not just rhythm, but you can make tunes if you know what you're doing, different kind of heads and the tautness of the heads and the way you strike them. Travis didn't know any of that. It was all uncertain sounds, and it didn't profit it sure didn't profit me anything. Kind of drove me nuts. Like a barbarian, it just didn't have any meaning. Even so, verse 12, ye, for as much as ye are zealous of spiritual gifts, seek that you may excel to the edifying of the church. So you guys want spiritual gifts operating in your midst. Seek the best ones. And the best ones are the ones that edify everybody. Not just some people, but they edify the whole church. That's why he says back in verse 5, I would that y'all speak with tongues, but rather that you prophesy. For greater is he that prophesieth than he that speaketh in an unknown tongue. You see, it's better to be able to communicate clearly what you have to say than it is to have all the other things, because when you speak with clarity, then people can be edified. And that's the big deal. That's the issue. So the tongues are really inferior to prophecy simply because they don't edify the believers. Verse 13, wherefore let him that speaketh in an unknown tongue pray that he may interpret. I mean, if you want to edify people, then pray for that gift. For if I pray in an unknown tongue, my spirit prayeth, but my understanding is unfruitful. What is it then? I will pray with the Spirit, and I will pray with the understanding also. That's a great verse, isn't it? That's how you ought to pray. You should never pray just words, mindless. You should pray out of a clear understanding of God's purpose and program today. I often refer to Matthew 6 when Jesus, his disciples wanted to teach us to pray. And he said, first of all, don't pray like the heathen pray. And that's a good practice. He said that they think they're going to be heard for their much speaking. You ever heard anybody say, well, I get everybody praying for me and God will move? I heard a guy on the radio today. He says, God's working in our midst. We got all these people praying and God's hand's working. I say, that's what the heathen say. They got the prayer wheel, spin the wheel, and they get everybody, and they think that God will hear them better if they got 100 people praying than if one person prayed. Well, that's praying like the heathen pray. You go to the prayer meeting in the average denominational church today, and they give prayer requests, and that's how you think the request is supposed to go. That's not in praying with understanding. Jesus told them, when you pray our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be. You can't pray that with understanding. You can pray that by rote repetition, but you see, we don't pray like Israel prayed. You don't pray like the heathen, you don't pray like Israel. When he said, our Father which art in heaven, that wasn't a good thing that God was in heaven. He had left Israel, gone to heaven, became the God of heaven. 2 Chronicles chapter 36. He was supposed to be the Lord God of all the earth, dwelling in Israel. He's left because of the captivity and their sin, and he's gone to heaven. He said, I'll hide myself until the time I return. Wasn't a compliment, wasn't a good thing. He was on exile. Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. That's what they're supposed to do. But it's to be hallowed on the earth. Ezekiel 36 is clear about that. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's how you hallow God's will in Israel's program. Then it says, give us this day our daily bread. Every time I hear that, I say, oh man, are you nuts? You got more food in your grocery, in your refrigerator, and in your pantry. You couldn't eat it all in 3 weeks. And you're saying, give us our daily bread. You see, that's unintelligible. That's not there's no understand. How do you understand that? It's certainly not that way. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. You want God to treat you that way? Not hardly. All of that fits in Israel's program. Put it where it goes. You'll find some people in the tribulation period, Revelation chapter number 12, that God's going to feed on a daily basis. He did that once before, you remember. He fed them with manna. He's going to do it again. Micah chapter 7 talks about it. Jeremiah chapter 50 talks about it. Revelation chapter 12 talks about it. They know those things. Satan tempted Christ. He said, turn that stone into bread. He understood God was going in the wilderness going to do that for some people. And it just wasn't at that time. Well, my wife and I were at a PTA meeting years ago. We lived in Elmwood Park. And we're sitting on a PTA meeting at the kids' school, and a fire truck went down the neighborhood street there, and everybody stopped. And it stopped. You could hear it stop about a block and a half away. And everybody, the lady running the PTA, she said, Mr. So-and-so, go down and see whose house is on fire. And then she said, I guess the rest of us should pray. And that whole group of people there, and they all bow their head and start praying, Our Father which art in heaven. And I'm thinking, there's nothing about a fire truck in that prayer. Well, what do you do? That's just vain repetition, which Jesus also warned about. So when you pray with your spirit, pray with the understanding also. You don't want to just pray, I don't want to just be praying gibberish and mysteries that I don't understand. I want to pray in a way that I understand what I'm saying, because that's where edification is going to come from. When you pray, you don't want to just be jabbering. And frankly, you can understand in the average Protestant, evangelical, Catholic, or pagan, everybody prays. Every religion prays. Everybody in the Bible prays. But how do you talk to God today? That's the issue. You can understand why they're doing it, but if you don't have any understanding about what God's doing, it's just nonsense. I will sing it with the Spirit, and I will sing with the understanding also. It's not a good idea to sing bad doctrine. When you sing, the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another, bad doctrine. No, teaching and admonishing one another. If the word of Christ dwells in you, you ought to be teaching one another the word of Christ. And a lot of times that doesn't happen either. Verse 16, else. Now here's when he's going to kind of nail them. Else what, when thou shalt bless with the Spirit, how shall he that occupieth the room of the unlearned say amen at thy giving of thanks, seeing he understandeth not what thou sayest? You see the importance that he's putting on these gifts were designed to communicate doctrine, revelation, information, encouragement to others, not just build yourself up. If you just simply read this passage, and the charismatic craziness could go away. For verse 17, for thou verily givest thanks well, but the other is not edified. Again, the edification is, it's the issue. You don't want to do without that. I thank my God, I speak with tongues more than you all. So the tongues were still in operation. By the way, that's a verse that you have to be careful about, isn't it? Somebody say, you guys tongue talk down there? We'll say, no. So, well, why? So we follow Paul. Well, Paul said, I speak in tongues more than you all. Why don't you follow Paul in that verse? You understand why? Can you grasp why understanding the transition period is important? There were some things that were there before Paul showed up that continued over in his early ministry. Why? Because they were signs to Israel. They were spiritual gifts that were signs to Israel, what? That God had left Israel and gone to the Gentiles. They were signs to the Gentiles that the God of Israel had left Israel and come among the Gentiles. And when they were in operation, they had a legitimate place in the edifying of the saints. And that's what he's talking about. Now watch why he says that. I thank God that I speak with tongues more than you all. Yet in the church, I had rather speak 5 words with my understanding, that my words might teach others also, than 10,000 words in an unknown tongue. Now that's quite a contrast, a ratio. 5 words to 10,000. In the beginning, God created. Those 5 words would help anybody more than everything anybody ever said in tongues. Christ died for our sins. Those 5 words would help anybody more than everything that ever been said in tongue talking. Paul said that you can communicate a lot, just those 5 words. And he said, I'd rather speak 5 words that people can understand so that it can edify them in the truth of God's Word than to speak 10,000 words that nobody grasps. Tongues don't edify the assembly. That's why they're not the most excellent. That's why they are the inferior gifts. Verse number 20, brethren, be not children in understanding. Now, not only don't they edify the church, they don't edify any of the believers. Be not children in understanding. Howbeit in malice be ye children, but in understanding be men. Now that's an interesting verse. When it comes to malice, be like a child. Have you watched children get mad at each other? 2 kids get in a fight. 5 minutes, they're over it. And they go on. Mamas are still standing there mad about what your little Johnny did to my little Matthew. What your little Rachel did to my little Sue. And mamas will hold a grudge for weeks. And the kids won't have any idea why mamas are mad at each other. Because children just get over it. They don't hold that grudge thing. Well, charity doesn't either. Back in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, charity doesn't keep the records of the wrongs. It doesn't hold the grudges. It doesn't remember all the offenses that are given against it. But when you don't have charity, you know what you do? You do. Your flesh is involved. So he says, be not children in understanding. Grow up. Get some edification. When it comes to malice, well, be a child. Get over it. But in understanding, be men. Understand why what's going on is going on. So he's going to explain it. In the law it is written, with men of other tongues and other lips will I speak unto this people, and yet for all that will they not hear me, saith the Lord. Wherefore tongues are for a sign, not to them that believe, but to them that believe not. But prophesying serveth not to them that believe not, but for them which believe. In other words, the tongue talking doesn't edify the individual. It's certainly not going to edify the unbeliever. And it's a sign. Now, what it's a sign of is important to understand in verse number 21. And that's why he introduces it by don't be a child when it comes to understanding. Be an adult. Understand why things are happening. In the law it is written, and by the way, when it says in 21, in the law, he's going to quote Isaiah 28. So notice that when he says in the law it is written, he isn't talking about the Pentateuch. He isn't talking about Moses. He's talking about the Old Testament. Sometime your whole Old Testament is called the law, God's book. So that term law can have the context has to tell you what the specific meaning in a passage is. Because when you see that right there, if you said the law, well, the law is first 5 books of Moses, they didn't hear it. It's Isaiah 28. And you'll find that happens a lot of times. In the law it is written, and this is going to be Isaiah 28, verse 11 and 12, with men of other tongues and other lips will I speak unto this people, yet for all that will they not hear me, saith the Lord. Now that's an interesting passage, because if you go back to Isaiah 28, that's talking about God is going to send the Assyrians into the northern kingdom of Israel and carry them away captive. And he says, you won't listen to me, so I'm going to speak to you in a foreign language. And when you hear that foreign language, those guys come in, they're going to be your captors. And because you won't hear me, they're going to be a sign, that foreign language coming in, taking you captive, is going to be a sign of my judgment on Israel. So when the tongues come in, he says in verse 22, tongues, all this foreign language is coming in, are for a sign, not to them that believe, but to them which believe not. Verse 21, for all that they will not hear me. Tongue talking was a sign of the judgment of God against unbelieving Israel. That's what the point in Isaiah 28 was, and that's the point here. Paul is showing them what kind of sign tongues are and what it said to Israel. And he did it by quoting Isaiah chapter 28. Those strange tongues of those Gentiles that came in there, the strange tongues in the Corinthian church, were a sign of God's setting Israel aside and going to the Gentiles. And the issue about the fall of Israel, the unbelieving, they will not hear me. The tongues weren't for the purpose of converting the nation. They were a manifestation of the judgment of God, that through the fall of Israel, salvation is going to the Gentiles. And when you see Israel's sign program, the tongues, any of them really, but when you see them among the Gentiles, they belong to Israel, so God's taken Israel's things and put them out there. It's a sign of the fall of Israel and salvation going to the Gentiles. It was a sign to the Gentiles that through their unbelief, the blessings come to you, not through their rise. So the tongue talking in the passage here uses tongues as the issue because he's contrasting the two. It's a sign, but it's fascinating. It's a sign to unbelievers. It's not a sign of spiritual maturity. It's not a sign of validation for believers. It's a sign to unbelievers about the fall of Israel. And it's a sign to Israel. Who were the unbelievers? That was Israel. If therefore the whole church come together in one place and all speak with tongues, and there come in those that are unlearned and unbelievers, will they not say that ye are mad? You guys are nuts. Now, you can see this on TV any day of the week. Turn to any Christian cable channel, and you can watch these services where people are doing this stuff, and they look kind of mad. Jitterbugging up and down around the aisle, screaming and hollering, hooting and hollering. It looks like something that you used to see on the National Geographic when they would go to Africa and take pictures of tribes out in the bush in Africa doing their drug-induced dances around the fire. Looks just about like that. You say, well, they're praising Jesus. But the question is, which Jesus? There's another one. And doesn't make it. You see, people have the idea if you're talking about the Bible and you're talking about Jesus, it must be right. You're wrong. It's not. So Paul's making the case here, and he's doing it right in the face of people who are nothing but abusing these things. And verse 23 to me is terribly telling. When the whole church comes together and they all speak with tongues. Well, then they all some of them are faking it. And when you fake it, you take away the authentic meaning of the miracle, of the gift. And you take away its value. So tongues were inferior to prophecy, not because they were unknown or illegitimate. They were known and they were legitimate. But if they didn't have an interpreter, then they didn't profit anybody because God wasn't doing it. And the whole issue is edification. And tongues don't edify the church. They don't edify the believers. And they certainly don't edify lost people. So the reason you prefer the better gifts, covet the best gifts, is because the issue is edifying the saints. And they have the gifts because they don't have a completed word. And once they have that completed word, then they don't need the gifts. But whether they have the gifts or the completed word, they need charity. And where does charity come from? You remember where we looked at that? Look at 1 Timothy. I wish you'd write this verse in your thinking. 1 Timothy 1:5. Now the end of the commandment is what? Charity. So where did charity come from? It's the result of the commandment. Now that's not the 10 Commandments. Look at verse number 7. People desiring to be teachers of the law. That's the 10 Commandments. Understanding neither what they say nor where they affirm, and we know that the law is good if a man use it lawfully, knowing this, that the law is not for a righteous man. Are you righteous? Sure you are. You've been saved. You've been made the righteousness of God in Jesus Christ. That's what justification is. Then the law isn't for you. So he's not talking about the Mosaic commandment in verse 5. What commandment is he talking about? Well, look at the 3 verses before it. Verse number 3. As I besought thee to abide still in Ephesus when I went into Macedonia, that thou mightest charge some. You know what you do when you charge somebody? Now, that's not like a master charge or a visa or like. That's an officer putting a subordinate under command. When I charge you, I command you. So there's the commandment. Paul just gave it to Timothy. What is it? Teach no other doctrine, neither give heed to fables and endless genealogy, which minister questions, rather than godly edifying, which is in faith, so do. So if you do what he said, don't change the doctrine you got from Paul. Teach what Paul taught you. Don't pay attention to the stories of the religious system. Don't pay attention to the personalities of people and the prestige of people. Just give yourself to godly edifying, which is in faith. Take the edification of sound doctrine that God has given to you through Paul, and you get that edification, and that produces charity. Charity doesn't come by loving everybody. Charity produces loving everybody. Charity doesn't come by, there's a sweet, sweet spirit in this place, let's just have a... It doesn't come by. Charity comes from doing what Paul just said. It comes from godly edification. Was he telling you in Corinthians? Prophecy produces what? Edification. Tongues, unless you got the interpreter, don't produce it. Got the interpreter, do it. Produce edification. But if you're faking it, if it's not real, there's no interpreter, well, there's no edification. The charity comes from the edification. And that's the most excellent ministry of the Holy Spirit, because it's the bond of perfectness, the bond of maturity. And what Paul's doing here is he's rebuking. He's teaching them in 1 Corinthians 14 how to handle the spiritual gifts with maturity that comes from godly edifying. Now I'm going to stop there because the time's up. We'll start in verse number 23 next time, and we'll examine these 6 rules that Paul gives for operating the spiritual gift of tongue talking. And when he said, I speak with tongues more than you all, here's how he did it. And for those people with whom tongues were in operation in their midst, he said, here's how you know when God is doing it And here's how you know when God isn't doing it. And can I tell you that every religion in the world has not only a water ceremony, they have a tongue-talking experience. It's a fascinating thing. The occult is filled with tongue-talking. It's filled the church, the evangelical church of our day. These tests, I call this stuff 6 things tongue talkers don't talk about, because if they did, it'd shut them up, put them out of business. Well, we'll see that next time, okay? Just remember the big issue is godly edifying. And the reason that there were better gifts is because they produced that in a better fashion. Okay? All right. Father, we thank you tonight for your love and your grace to us. We thank you for your word. And I thank you for people that love your word and that love you. Wherever they might be, whatever confusion they might be in, whatever craziness they may be caught up in, we all get ourselves caught in those things. But I pray we might have the ability to speak clearly, with charity, with care, with concern, but most of all with truth. So that folks whose heart looks for truth, desires truth, wants to have your truth be what they stand on, might be able to see it, cut through the fog, and stand squarely upon the completeness of your word and the sufficiency of your grace. And we thank you for that privilege in Christ's name.